Okay, Devan Murugan from the Money Desk is here with us. Good afternoon, Devan. What's happening investment-wise in the country?
Yeah, we've got the budget coming up, Radian, on Wednesday, and I see the International Monetary Fund is already warning that South African local banks are just taking on too much government debt. And you'll know the background to this. We were downgraded internationally, so you have a scenario where the international foreign investors are saying, well, hang on, we've got to wait, and that poses some problems. But let's start with that story. So South Africa losing its investment grade, as I said, in 2020. As a result, foreign investors were less willing to borrow government money in the form of bonds. Local banks bought up the bonds that foreign investors sold when they quit the market and also took up some of the government's new borrowing. Well, we've got this budget coming up on Wednesday, the national budget with Finance Minister eNCA, just to see how this really fits in the context of things. Senior economist Iraj Abedian joins me now. Iraj, if you can hear me, thanks very much indeed for talking to me.
Thank you very much, Devan. I think the concerns that IMF expresses is a very serious concern and indicates at two levels. One is at the level of financial stability, which means when the government overborrows, and the government borrowing is now exceeding 4 trillion and rising potentially 5, depending how quickly we can get economic growth revived and stabilized. At the moment, there is no sign of that. And for as long as economic growth remains at the level of 1%, 1.5%, which are the current projections, we're going to head for more and more government borrowing. And if the government runs into financial instability, then immediately banks run into financial instability and the entire macroeconomic financial status becomes unstable. So that is the so-called covariance risk that we run. At the same time, the second risk, the more banks channel their resources to investing in government bonds, the less they invest in the private sector, which means then economic growth is further undermined. And that in itself is a serious structural issue that we need to deal with.
And Iraj, I suppose that, your last point really underscores why an institution like the IMF would be concerned. Because, as you say, if banks get too committed to the government, you've got less capital that goes into the economy that brings up these investments in infrastructure projects, and we're back to square one with employment.
Absolutely. And that in itself really suggests that the economy is facing a kind of a stalemate, meaning the banks would want ordinarily to follow more private sector, more higher return type of prospects or paper or bond or shares. But because the private sector is not investing, because the structural adjustments or policy reforms have been talked about and nothing done, it means the private sector is not investing. Banks are a little bit cautious of overexposure to the private sector because they've had corporate failures, and that means they lose. So they go for safe options. Well, what is a safe option at the moment? Government bond, as you mentioned, because we downgraded, or the South African government is downgraded, its yield is higher than it should be. So the banks are saying, well, relative to the private sector, which is stuck and not investing, government is still safer. And then we get into this vicious circle, which we want to get out of. And that really highlights the absolute urgent need for policy reform so that we revive the economic growth and get out of this logjam.
I want to bring this now to what happens on Wednesday. It's the national budget. We've just had the crime stats being released. Last year we had about 104 billion rand dedicated to the police, Iraj. And what people would do on Wednesday is very simply look at this budget, see these huge figures, and then just say, well, we've just had crime stats that has the murder rate up. We feel less safer. Prioritization on Wednesday is going to be very important, is it? How do you see it?
I think, again, this is a debate that we've had in the country for 10 years. We cannot equate more money allocated to health, education, police, housing, roads as more services. There is a very critical link here, and that is about the efficiency of public sector spend, or value for money, if you prefer. So the Minister of Finance can only allocate money. But if the departments are inefficient, if the police is not up to standard, if government officials are corrupt and spending those money, if there is dispute between the Minister of Police and the Commissioner of Police and all the other issues that have been in the public, those are not solvable by money. We can actually pour more money into a broken machine and get less value from it. So Devan, what we need to do on Wednesday, hopefully, and I think 4 ministers of finance that I recall have spoken about it, and ministers, which is value for money, for the money that the taxpayer spends. The reality is politics has gone off the rail and does not focus on getting meritocracy or competency or expertise in government departments, so that when we allocate money for them on Wednesday, we know that we'll get better value for it. That's the problem.
Oh, well, that's a point. Well, thanks very much indeed, Iraj Abedian, the chief economist at Pan-African Capital. Thanks indeed for your time. Well,